Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking a close look at introversion, and we're going to be focusing on this great article from Very Well Mind that you sent in called 8 Signs You Might Be an Introvert.
Yeah, it's a really popular one. I've seen it shared a lot.
Yeah, for good reason. I mean, it really digs into what introversion really means, you know?
Yeah.
Like beyond just being quiet or shy.
That's right. There's so much more to it than that.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about introversion is that it's the same thing as being shy, like they're interchangeable terms or something.
Yeah, and the article does a great job of making it clear that those are two very different things.
Right away, like right in the intro, it's like, boom, they're not the same.
Right off the bat.
Yeah, so how does the article actually define introversion?
Well, they say it's a personality trait characterized by a focus on internal feelings rather than external sources of stimulation.
Okay, so what does that actually mean in like real world terms? I think a good way to think about it is like how you recharge your batteries, so to speak.
Oh, like some people get energy from being around others, like they're the life of the party and they leave feeling even more energized.
Exactly. But for introverts, it's the opposite.
It's kind of like they might enjoy the party, but it drains their energy and they need some quiet time alone to kind of recover.
Yeah. It's not that they don't like people, it's just that social interaction takes a different kind of energy for them.
So then does that mean all introverts are like hermits or something?
No, not at all. That's another big myth that the article tackles head on.
Okay, good, because I was picturing like someone living in a cabin in the woods, never talking to anyone.
And that's just not accurate.
Yeah.
Introverts can be social, they can enjoy going out and being around people, but they might need more downtime afterwards.
Right. So it's about balance then.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance that works for you.
Okay, so we've busted the shyness myth and the hermit myth. What else does the article say about what introversion isn't T?
Well, another important point is that introversion is not the same as depression.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because sometimes people might see someone who's withdrawn and automatically assume they're depressed, but that's not always the case, right?
Absolutely not. Depression is a serious mental health condition, and while some of the symptoms might overlap with introversion, they are distinct things.
So like enjoying alone time is one thing, but if someone is constantly withdrawing from social situations and also experiencing like persistent sadness or anxiety, then it's important to seek professional help.
Exactly. It's crucial to distinguish between those two things.
Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of what introversion isn't, let's dive into those 8 signs the article highlights.
All right, let's do it.
Sign number 1, drained by social interaction. We kind of touched on this already, but it's worth emphasizing that this feeling of being depleted after social events is a hallmark of introversion.
Yeah, it's a pretty common experience.
And it all comes down to brain science, right?
Yeah, you got it. The article gets into this thing called the reticular activating system, or RAS, which is basically like the brain's volume control for stimulation.
So like how sensitive we are to things happening around us.
Yeah, and introverts tend to have a higher baseline arousal level, meaning their volume knob is already turned up, so to speak.
So they're just naturally more sensitive to external stimuli.
Exactly. So something like a social gathering, which might be energizing for an extrovert, can feel really overwhelming for an introvert because it's like adding more sound to an already loud room.
Wow, that makes so much sense. So it's not about disliking socializing, it's more about how it affects their energy levels.
Right. And that brings us to the second sign, love of solitude. For introverts, spending time alone isn't a punishment or anything, it's a necessity.
It's how they recharge, like plugging into a power source.
Exactly. They create that space for their internal volume knob to turn down a bit, and they can focus on their own thoughts and feelings.
Okay, so it's less about being alone and more about being intentional with their time and energy.
That's a great way to put it.
And I bet this ties into the next sign, small, close friend groups.
Oh, absolutely. Introverts often prefer deeper connections with a smaller group of people, rather than having a huge network of acquaintances.
Yeah, it's about quality over quantity for them.
Exactly. And it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
If social interaction can be draining, it's natural to be more selective about who you spend your time with.
And those close friendships are super important, even for introverts.
Of course. We all need connection and belonging, regardless of our personality type.
So it's not about being antisocial, it's about being intentional about those social connections.
Exactly. And that also plays into another sign, reserved demeanor. Introverts might not be the first to jump into a conversation or be the loudest voice in the room, but that doesn't mean they're not engaged or interested.
Yeah, it's more like they're taking their time to process things internally before sharing their thoughts.
They're the careful observers, the listeners, the ones who think before they speak.
I like that. It's like they're composing their responses in their head before hitting the send button.
Exactly. Hashtag TTS, the deep dive episode 2024-10-29, part 2 of 3.
It's like they're really taking in the whole scene before jumping in.
Exactly. And that leads us to the next sign, which is overwhelmed by stimulation.
Oh, this one I get for sure. Yeah, like if I'm in a place where there's just like too much going on, like a crowded, noisy place, it can be really overwhelming, and I just need to get out of there, like find a quiet corner or something.
I can see that, yeah.
So is that what they mean by overwhelmed by stimulation?
Yeah, exactly. Remember that higher baseline arousal we talked about? For introverts, too much external stimulation can just be too much, like sensory overload.
Like adding fuel to a fire that's already burning pretty strong.
Exactly. So instead of seeking out that extra stimulation, they're more likely to try and create environments that are more calm and manageable.
So like instead of going to a loud concert, they might prefer a quiet night in with a book or something.
Or a walk in nature, something like that.
Makes sense. Okay, so next on the list is high self-awareness.
Yeah, and I think this one is really interesting.
What's interesting about it?
Well, the article points out that introverts tend to be more in tune with their own thoughts and feelings.
So they're kind of like more introspective.
Exactly. They spend a lot of time reflecting on their experiences, thinking about their emotions, and trying to understand their motivations.
Which can be a really good thing. I mean, that kind of self-awareness can be really helpful for personal growth.
Absolutely. And it also connects to the next sign, observational learning. Introverts often learn best by watching and listening, kind of absorbing information before jumping into action.
That's interesting. So it's not that they're not active learners, it's just that they have a different approach.
Right. They're gathering information and processing it internally before they take action.
Like they're strategizing their moves.
Exactly. And then finally, the article mentions jobs with independence as being a good fit for introverts.
So does that mean all introverts should be freelancers or entrepreneurs?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
But it's true that they often thrive in roles that offer autonomy and focus, where they have some control over their environment and their schedule.
Makes sense.
But that doesn't mean they can't excel in other types of jobs. It's all about finding the right fit.
Right. And even in a more collaborative setting, they can still find ways to create those pockets of quiet and focus that they need.
Exactly. And speaking of different types, the article mentions that there are actually different types of introverts.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It's not just one size fits all, right?
Right. They talk about 4 main types: social, thinking, anxious, and restrained.
Okay, so break it down for me. What's the difference between those?
Well, the social introvert, like we've been talking about, enjoys spending time with people, but they're selective about their social circles, maybe preferring smaller gatherings or one-on-one interactions.
So not a huge fan of parties then?
Maybe not huge ragers, no, but they still value those connections.
Okay, what about the thinking introvert?
The thinking introvert is all about that inner world. Lots of thoughts, ideas. They love to explore concepts in depth.
The deep thinkers.
Exactly. And then we have the anxious introvert.
This is where it might get confused with social anxiety, right?
Yeah, there could be some overlap there.
But not always.
Right. An anxious introvert might enjoy socializing, but they also experience a certain level of discomfort or worry in those settings.
So like the desire to connect, but also the fear of being judged or something.
That's one way to put it.
Okay. And the last type is the restrained introvert, right?
That's right. The restrained introvert is all about being cautious and deliberate, taking their time to process things and make decisions.
Like the planner of the group.
Definitely. Always thinking things through carefully.
So these are just general categories, and people can have traits from different types, right?
Absolutely. It's all part of what makes us unique.
Right. And it makes you wonder, like, are we born with these tendencies, or is it something we develop over time? Nature versus nurture, right?
That's a great question. And the article does touch on that a bit.
What does it say?
Well, they say that introversion likely comes from a combination of genetic predisposition and environmental influences.
So, like, there might be a biological basis for it, but our experiences also shape how it manifests.
Exactly. They mentioned some studies that show introverts might have a more sensitive nervous system, but then upbringing and social experiences can also play a role.
It's fascinating how all these factors come together to create our personalities.
It really is. Yeah. And it's not just about what makes introverts different, but also what are their strengths,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like the article highlights some really positive qualities.
Such as?
Well, for one, introverts are often excellent listeners, which is a valuable skill in any relationship.
Yeah, they're not always trying to dominate the conversation, so they're really paying attention to what others are saying.
Exactly. And they tend to be empathetic and insightful, picking up on subtle cues that others might miss.
So they're good at reading people?
In a way, yeah. And they're also often very creative. They have these rich inner worlds that fuel their imagination.
The artists and writers and thinkers.
Exactly. So yeah, there's a lot to appreciate about introversion.
It's not just about being quiet or shy. It's a whole way of experiencing the world.
And a valuable one at that.
I agree. Hashtag TTS, the deep dive episode 2024-1029, part 3 of 3.
It really is a whole different way of seeing things.
For sure. And this deep dive, looking at this Very Well Mind article, it's been really eye-opening.
It's given us a lot to think about.
It has. I feel like I have a much better understanding of, well, myself, for one thing, but also like how other people experience the world.
And that's what's so cool about, exploring these different personality types, right?
Totally. It's like it helps us all get along better when we understand where each other is coming from.
Exactly. And I think that leads nicely into how the article wraps things up.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, instead of giving us like a definitive answer or, a set of rules to follow, it ends with more of an open-ended question.
I like that it leaves us with something to ponder.
Yeah, it asks, think about your own social interactions and energy levels. Where do you fall on the introversion-extroversion spectrum?
So it's not about like putting ourselves in a box or anything. It's more about using this knowledge as a starting point.
Right. It's like an invitation to explore our own preferences and, recognize our strengths and how our personality influences how we interact with the world.
And maybe challenge some of the assumptions we have about ourselves and others.
Exactly. So, whether you identify as an introvert, an extrovert, or somewhere in between, the important thing is to embrace your authentic self.
And to remember that there's no right or wrong way to be. It's all about celebrating our differences.
Beautifully said. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into introversion.
This has been fascinating. Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
My pleasure. Always happy to chat about personality.
And a huge thank you to all of you for listening. We hope you learned something new today about introversion and maybe even about yourselves. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep rocking your own unique style.